Hello, everyone, and welcome. Oh, sorry, a little too hot. Let's start over. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bad End Podcast, episode 113. That's 113. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Joshua Calixto.
What it do?
That's your cue. There you go. We are gathered on this holy of Sundays to talk about our Lord and Savior, Elden Ring.
George R. Martin.
The Grim X Miyazaki joint coming to you live from the electronics section at Walmart, the next biggest cultural games touchstone milestone. We are a video game podcast and we usually talk about a lot of different video games, but on this episode,
we're
going to talk about Elden Ring. It's Elden Ring is here, man. I am already tired of saying the phrase Elden Ring. It is the worst name for perhaps one of the best games of all time, and we're going to get into that. Josh, I think you share some similar things. But
let's back up.
Okay.
Demon's Souls.
Yeah.
Dark Souls is not a very good name for a video game either.
It's not, but I think something about the name Elden Ring feels worse. I think in part because it feels like it's trying to be a thing. Like an Elden Ring feels like what you read about in like B tier fantasy. Oh, seek the Elden Ring. And everyone's like, yeah, Demon's Souls doesn't like make English grammatical sense. And Dark Souls sounds like worse than Elden Ring. But somehow they're so bad. They kind of, it's like the name Xerox or something, it's just kind of, it became, I forgot what the name of these words are. It became a thing that just means the thing itself. Whereas like Elden Ring is like, George, could you have not done that one? Could you have just not?
Yeah. So, I mean, do you want to start by like talking about what?
Let's talk. Okay. For people who don't know, so the game Elden Ring came out now a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago.
Yeah, just over a week.
This is the latest game from the acclaimed game studio From Software, who most notably made Dark Souls 2, Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and now Elden Ring. Elden Ring is in a similar lineage. It is a Souls-like game. And all the Souls games, as well as Sekiro to a degree, and definitely Bloodborne, sort of share a Ludo relationship with each other. They all play very similarly. They are notoriously difficult games to play. And this is the latest game in that series. This game is notable not just because it's a Souls game, which is a big deal. These games are, I'll probably get into this too. These games are really hard, so they typically tend to inspire kind of like very fervent fan base. The game is a big deal because it's the first sort of like open world Souls game, which again, we can talk about that a little more because I think that is actually a contentious statement. And then the kind of big press beat for this that has basically been totally lost, I would say, outside of like the first marketing beat, was that none other than George R. Martin, Mr. Song of Ice and Fire himself, Mr. Winter is Coming. I never saw more than like the first 3 episodes of the first season of the show, so I don't actually know how many other good references I can pull. Mr. Red Wedding, I know that's a thing. He contributed to the story for this game. I think this is funny in part because the Souls games, I think, have never actually suffered for having bad stories. I think they've all been generally pretty cool and weird. So the idea that they had to like tap a good writer it's a notable writer in general to like write a story is strange, especially because they've proved time and time again they're good at telling dark fantasy stories. So I'm not really sure what Georgie R's is bringing to the table. But anyways, the big deal with this game is that, hey, it's a Souls game. It's open world. George R. Martin wrote the story. And that's where they get you at the start. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, maybe check out Elden Ring. But also worth noting, So we're also talking about this not just because like we're both fans of Souls games, but I don't know if you saw this, Josh, but the word on the street in the sales charts is that this is one of the biggest video game releases of all time. Like I think it's the biggest release. It's some insane number. Like it's like the third biggest game release of all time. Like there was like something like 750,000 concurrent players on Steam, which was like the number 4 or 5 top most played game of all time on Steam in terms of concurrent players. Like game is big, like big. So we're talking about it for that reason, but also it's like very weird that this game is so big because this is a weird game for a lot
Okay,
of
so
reasons
if you
that we can go into.
let's rewind a little bit. A couple things which I think
Take me back.
will dive us a little bit deeper into conversation here. First off, you talked about how this is, Souls is critically acclaimed, but the more I play this game, I guess like starting out to play this game, every time I pick up a new FromSoft game, I kind of realize the extent to which this is the most influential video game and or video game series of the last couple decades. Like hands down, far and away. We talk about Souls on pretty much every episode of this podcast. Everyone talks like its legacy is, it's impossible to underestimate the legacy of this series. So the fact that they are taking it in a new direction and making it open world theoretically is a big deal. And I think that there is a lot to talk about here because, but it's hard to know where to start.
I think, the way you can kind of like slice it is, I think like on its face. So I think like getting like the base stuff out of the way, right? It's a Souls game. It is hard. It's hard to play. It's difficult. The world is like big and scary and like blah, blah, blah. It's dark fantasy stuff. I think the thing that maybe first start talking about is kind of the biggest thing that it's doing, so to speak, compared to the other games, which is this concept of like an open world. And this is like, I think it's debatable a bit about if the previous Souls games were an open world games. I think when we say open world, we're really like talking about like capital O, capital W, open world game as like a genre in and of itself, not just the concept of like a world without borders. So more in the sense that like, yes, in Dark Souls 1, maybe DS3, maybe Sekiro, definitely sort of true with Bloodborne. Like in those games, yes, you can kind of sort of like go anywhere from the start if you know where to go and you can like survive long enough. So that you're not like progression gated like in Halo or something where you have to like beat this before you go to the next area. Like you can just straight up run to the end of the game and stuff like the Souls games. And so that technically is not necessarily an innovation here. However, it is open world in the sense that it is trying to be an open world game in the way that something like, Horizon Forbidden West just came out, Breath of the Wild, Assassin's Creed. It's like more playing in sort of that domain of an open world game. I think that that's maybe the first thing to talk about, which is like,
it's more sandboxy.
It's more sandboxy. Someone in the Discord sort of described it as a Dark Souls or like a Souls game that's just kind of like expanded and like stretched out. And I'm interested because Josh, you not actually a big Souls person, but you did really like Sekiro. And I remember you like got pretty far in Bloodborne. But
I beat Dark Souls. Dark Souls and Sekiro are the only ones I beat. The other ones I played around 10 hours of each one.
Yeah. So you have enough to have a reference point. Like I'm interested sort of in how do you feel about the open worldness of Elden Ring?
Well, first of all, I'll say that Elden Ring is more fun to me than all of those games. It's more inviting. There's more about it to enjoy as, I think, a player of a video game. The reason why I haven't beaten a lot of the Souls games is because it's so oppressive and intense, and the difficulty isn't even necessarily part of that. I know I can beat these games. It's not that I can't do that. But I would get to a place like Blighttown, which is this notoriously disgusting area in Dark Souls. And I would just, I'd get stuck there. I would get stuck on a part. I'd die a bunch of times. And I'm like, I just don't. Then, and then I think the critical moment is when you put down the game, and then you have to take the initiative to turn the game back on and dive back in. And when I would get to a part like that, I'm like, do I really want to experience this? Just the sense of fear, the sense of, I guess, like difficulty being presented with this seemingly insurmountable challenge, the disgust, just all the anger, all the emotion. It's a lot to handle. And I think in the past games, there weren't as many ways for you to escape that.
Yeah.
Or there weren't many options if you did run into one of these moments. There was nothing to kind of clear your head, or like there was no escape from that. And so even if you went to your central hub world where you could go back to different places, and you decided maybe I'll grind and do the JRPG thing of just like grinding levels and coming back later when I'm stronger, even if you were to try to do that, you would invariably have to go back to something that was just like disgusting, or like almost as difficult or almost as oppressive as what you were kind of facing before. So it never felt like you had any sort of escape from that. What Elden Ring does is it gives you that ability to go kind of somewhere else if you want. If you get stuck on something, you can just go somewhere else. You could just explore something, and you'll always have something new to uncover. And there's a high likelihood that there's another place that you would find that is just a more pleasant space within which to exist. There's characters for you to find that will have valuable things to say. There are vistas for you to look at where you're not like in constant mortal danger. And I think that variety within this game, and the fact that a lot of it is so immediately accessible to you, is what makes it, to me at least, a more inviting, more quote fun experience to actually play. Now I had this feeling with Sekiro too, I think, to a large extent. But I didn't feel like I had a lot of options in Sekiro, but I guess the thing that kept me playing that game was that the challenge was it was strictly about the boss in front of me, and the game took away a lot of the space between me and those bosses, and it didn't make it as, I guess, gross for me to have to deal with that stuff. I think the sense of motion and the fluidity of how you would get around the world just made me feel a lot more free, made it feel a lot more pleasant for me to exist and like kind of ram my head against that same wall 100 times than any of the other Souls games have. So I think Elden Ring combines that sense of kind of lightness, that sense of with that sense that you're able to kind of escape when you are in a difficult situation that you don't want to deal with anymore.
Yeah, I think like especially I remember in Sekiro and Bloodborne, just because those are the most recent ones I've played, like I mean I really want to drill in on this point. I think that like the difference between like an open world game and like a capital O capital W open world game, because Souls fans will be like, and people in their Discord say this, like technically Dark Souls is an open world game. Yes. However, Elden Ring is open world in kind of a different way. And the differences between these things are not like so rigid that it's very easy to have it. It's like it's a gradient, right? But in like Sekiro and Bloodborne, like I remember specifically, just because they're again the most recent ones I played, like I would get to a point where I'd be like, all right, there's like kind of two open paths to me, and there's a really hard boss at the end of that one and a really hard boss at the end of that one. And like there's no like, well, let me just turn around and go some other direction. It's like you just got to get good enough to beat either of those. Like you just have to beat one of them, and there's no getting around that. I mean, again, you can run past it, but I'm not trying to do that. You have to beat one or the other. And I think in Elden Ring, like you get your ass handed to you with like Marguerite or whatever at the front of Stormvale, and you just go a different direction. I do think, and I really want to talk about this maybe in a little bit, that because of that, there are things that Elden Ring introduces as sort of problems to the Souls formula, and kind of moving this open world direction. But I do think, yeah, there's definitely in Elden Ring, like it's sort of more accessible in a way, because instead of having to just like get your ass beat over and over, you can turn around and kind of go somewhere else. Granted, the world is still really difficult, so it's not like you're going to find stuff that's substantially easier. And even then, the stuff that's easier is not necessarily going to give you a lot of reward. So you're going to kind of be in this like negative feedback cycle. Um, not it's not necessarily like the optimal thing to be doing, but there is a way where you're like, listen, I'm gonna, like, I know right now I can think of one boss, the fucking Crucible Knight, where I'm just like, I'm gonna come back to that later. Like, I'm just not trying to do that right now, and that is not something that I can necessarily do in other Souls games, really.
I did that with
I think
Crucible
that's
Knight as
cool.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I want to take up too about Sekiro that I think is sort of interesting, in terms of like the ask. I think especially in Sekiro compared to the Souls games and Bloodborne, it like basically totally gets rid of like most of your optionality from like a stats perspective. I think there's like a real way in Bloodborne and actually is even in case in, I think it is the thing in Bloodborne. I don't remember, but definitely in the Souls games, you have like 10 stats or so, and like you can allocate points to those stats, and your weapons and your skills get better based on how you allocate those points. That is like mostly non-existent in Sekiro. So you're never running around finding these bosses in Sekiro wondering like, have I fucked up with my skill allocations? Because there's, you can't really mess up in Sekiro with
Yeah.
that. You can like I think Josh, you said it during the podcast when the game first came out. You were like, you basically have enough at the start of the game to like beat the whole game, and that is like not the case for most people with the Souls games, where like you can have a bad build, like you can spec yourself the wrong way and put yourself in a hole with your stats that makes it really like makes it like exponentially harder for you to do something than if you were to sort of spec correctly. And I think that reducing that and kind of getting rid of that is one of the beauties of Sekiro, where it's like, no, like you have everything you need right now to do this. And Elden Ring, as well as the other Souls games, are like, you probably don't have what you need to do this right now. And like, yes, you can like do soul level 1 playthroughs where you're like really good and you can just kind of like wreck stuff. But that's like not the case for most people in these games. And like, you will just be in a better position if you have higher levels, better gear, whatever. So Elden Ring kind of again moves away from the Sekiro model, I think for good reason, but also that's I think what makes Sekiro in a way, even though it's really hard in other ways, it makes it more approachable in some ways, because it's like, listen, you don't have to, that part of you that says I'm not like configured correctly is just not there. Which I think is gives people that sense of like, I can do this because I have the right build, I have the right skills.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the compound effect of a lot of this stuff is something that we talked about in the last episode or whatever episode. I think we talked about Sekiro recently. I think this was the last episode, but
Yeah.
Talked about how that experience felt more authored to me than a lot of
Yeah.
the older Souls game. And I want to kind of expand on what I mean by that, because I think that Elden Ring takes it to even the next step of what an authored Souls game might feel like, which is to say that
Beyond Sekiro, you think that really?
yeah, I
Okay.
really, I
Okay. Okay.
do. So what I mean by authored is that I don't know if, I guess it feels like there's more intent that is baked into the experience, or that there's a lot more to be read into. There's a lot less room for interpretation. There's a lot more like, this is what this game means. Still a lot less of that than you would find in the average video game. But I think that overall the series is inching more and more towards something that is a bit less open to interpretation, that has a bit more like baked in meaning, a bit more subtext that is easier to read into, and less stuff that is just like vague and for you to kind of sit there and think about the implications of over a longer period of time.
Maybe just more characters, right? Like just per like,
yeah, I mean, that's part of
NPCs
it.
in Souls game have been like non-exist. I mean, there's been people, but like there's a lot more characters kind of running around in Elden Ring.
But this is the thing about the original Dark Souls, and I guess Demon Souls by extension, is that these games had this sense, there was a lot of empty space in those games, a lot of room for interpretation. And it wasn't just in the way that the lore that they offered you. It wasn't just that there was like gaps in the storytelling. It was in the way that the world itself was designed, right? Like you would be in some massive fortress or some massive circuit of underground caves or some huge castle. And you could kind of look out and see this world beyond you, but you couldn't visit it. It was like these pre-baked, backgrounds that you could kind of look out on and be like, I wonder what this world used to be. Or like you'd be in a cavern and some spider lived there or something. You'd be like, what the hell was this spider? Like, how did they play into the larger lore of this story? And these were all questions that you had that were very, I guess, clear and very much set in front of you. And there were these unknowable aspects about the game where you could sit there and really figure out like where all these different storylines go. And you could watch these, 30 episode series of videos on YouTube that would like the lore of Dark Souls explained. But even then it wouldn't be like a full story top to bottom with all these themes and whatnot. And I think part of the experience of those games was supposed to be, hey, you're never going to know everything that there is to know about these games. And that's what provides all of those worlds with their mystique. The fact that you couldn't go everywhere on the map, that you could look at a building that was, beyond the scope of where you were able to travel and wonder what that was. There was a lot more of those in the earlier Souls games, I would say. And in Sekiro,
it was like the limitations of like the format.
Yes.
Like moving into narrative necessity,
which felt
to say
very
like
purposeful even for the time, because they were it's not like they couldn't do an open world at that time. It's not like those didn't exist at the time. Like 2010, Red Dead Redemption was already out. So it's like, it's not that the open world was not an option for them. It was that by restricting the scope of the game, they were able to tell a story that felt like there was more that was beyond human understanding, or like more than you could possibly ever understand.
The structure of like Souls and like especially Dark Souls and like Demon Souls to an extent was like the world had like already happened. I think that the difference between those and like Elden Ring is that like history is sort of happening right now in the scope of the story of Elden Ring. And in like all the Souls games prior, it's like Anne Orlando used to be this beautiful city, or like the king used to exist and it's a ruined world or whatever, like very like ruins core or something. And I think that there is some of that stuff still in Elden Ring, but I think that now there's so much more of an active sense of like things are happening right now and you're sort of partaking in them as they kind of happen and unfold.
It still doesn't, it's one step toward the world being a whole place. It's
not like
still
Dragon
not there.
Quest.
It's still definitely ruins porn, but
still lots of ruins.
Yes, but you're right. It does feel like a step or two more toward a living space. I think also the stuff that got like kind of lost in translation, a lot of the stuff that felt extremely not localized, that felt very like a foreigner's take, like someone who's not a Westerner's take on Western culture, was very much a part of the original Souls experiences. Like the whole like all those the things that it would show in front of you when you would like die or like get your soul back or whatever. The memes things like you defeated or whatever.
Yeah.
Like when you kill a boss, it says like you defeated.
There's stuff here.
But it says like enemy felled, and it makes sense. It like makes sense to an English speaker. It's not like a silly weird. But I think all of like those weird translations, the overuse of thine, Remember that? Every Souls game, it was like thine place in the, and it was like, this is not how Western fantasy fiction really works. But this is, and it just makes it all feel really weird. The monster
Yeah.
design, there was all just so much there where you never felt like, oh, this means this because I have this cultural knowledge. I guess because in Western fantasy, we have these motifs and symbols that we know. So like if you're looking at an elf, you already know what the fucking elf is. Like okay, they're the ones who, maybe there's some sort of like prejudice against them, or maybe they're like these really classy figures in the
Are
world
they
that
racist
live
elves, or are they
forever.
racist?
There's like the
Are they prejudiced?
dwarves
Yeah.
who are a bit more brash. They live underground. They do mining. They do like there's all sorts of different archetypes that exist in Western fantasy that when they are put in front of us, we already know what to think. So there's already so much less space to do stuff there. But in FromSoft stuff, there's like a fucking tortoise that looks like the Pope. There's a fucking like the dung eater whose thing is like he just eats shit and stuff. Like it's stuff you've never seen before in this type of media, and they still have that in Elden Ring, but some of it has taken steps toward that easier to read Western.
That's that Georgie Martin.
That's the
touch,
George
man.
and that's why I want to talk about the George R. R. Martin stuff. Because when George R. R. Martin came up in the early discussions about this game, it was like he could either have like a very terrible impact, or it could just be that his name is stamped on it and he didn't do anything. He like clearly didn't do anything. I don't know if it's the George R. R. Martin impact, but this game feels a lot more localized. It feels a lot more like it's taken on aspects of Western fantasy, and there's a lot more stuff that feels familiar. For instance, like all of the quote good force in this game is called grace. So if you know how we used to have bonfires, now you have these like sites of grace. You quote touch grace in order to like kind of rest your soul, and it's this force in the world that you follow and is good and is bright and kind of embodies all of it, at least on its surface. That's what it does. You start the idea becomes a little bit complicated a little bit further down, as one might expect. I don't think that's much of a spoiler, but grace is so much more of a Western religious concept that like I don't know it would have really been in these games if it wasn't for someone like George R. R. Martin. But like the way that the writing is in this game, so much more of it feels like something that you would read in one of his books, or that you might see in what's Game of Thrones, you know?
This is, I sort of said this on the Discord as well, where I was like, it feels like if you asked sort of an art house director in the 70s to like make a Marvel movie, where there's like, the thing I'll say about Elden Ring, despite the Martin touch, is there's still like some weird fucking shit in this game that I was like not expecting. That like I definitely thought like we're watching someone play through the game a little bit on the YouTube video right now, and they're in Limgrave, which is the starting area, and it's kind of like fantasy. And like I thought Elden Ring was going to be a lot of this, and I was like, I don't know. I come to Dark Souls because it's like fucking weird and like creepy and gross. And let me tell y'all, this game's got a lot of that. I feel like in terms of, we should talk about spoilers real fast. This is not a spoiler cast, so you feel free to listen safely. I think that we'll probably talk mostly about stuff in Limgrave. I don't want to get too far out of there.
Yeah.
But rest assured, y'all, there's some like Bloodborne ass shit in this game that is fucking wild, and I am so heartened to see it because I'm with you, Josh. Like I saw some of this stuff, and like part of the reason I was not excited about this game when it was like first coming out was I was like, it just looks like a boring fantasy game. Like they got the fucking most like white nerd boy approved writer to come write a fantasy story for a game that I didn't think needed any sort of help with the story, to come write some boring ass fantasy Dark Souls game. And like there is that stuff. And then I feel like when George R. R. Martin is not looking, Miyazaki and his crew went and did their thing and made the game fucking weird. but there are definitely parts of it where there's like, I think this sort of gets a little bit of the like ease of approachness, is that you're no longer like collecting souls, you're collecting runes. The
Yeah.
good stuff is called grace. It's not called like arcane. Like there's a knight in a castle that you have to go kill. And like the framing, I think at a baseline is exactly what you're talking about, where it's got this like way more like affinity for a Western audience, especially. Not to say these games are made for the West, but that there's like the indicators of like, hey, can you help me make sort of Arthurian fantasy is like there. And that sort
Mm-hmm.
of baseline was definitely never there before. Maybe with like Dark Souls 2 a little bit, but like the game like 1 and 3 and Bloodborne are like not that at all. Um so but
Well,
they complicate it pretty
all
quickly.
of this
But
is
yeah.
I mean, I don't want it to come off as if I'm saying that this game is like a totally westernized version. And I know you're not saying that, but I don't want it to
Mhm.
come off that way to the listener either, because this is still very much Souls. It's just that the writing feels like, as Kyle's saying, it just feels like the localization is a little bit more it penetrates a bit deeper than it has in past games. And a lot of the stuff is like, someone will tell me something and I just understand it right away, which is not something I'm used to experiencing in Souls games. You'll talk to a character who's just like, you're just shooting the shit with a character and you're just like, oh, that was a good conversation. That's not really something that happens in Souls games up until
Yeah.
this point. And it
Yeah.
happens to me quite a bit in this game, where someone will just like be telling you lore, just talking to you about lore. And you'd be like, and there's the option to ask more about lore and stuff like that. It feels more like a traditional video game. The lore feels like it's framed in a bit more of a way that's easier to recognize for Western audiences, but it's still capable of those surprises that a lot of FromSoft stuff is. There's some totally wild shit, but what I have noticed playing over the course of the game, I'm about 45 hours in, I want to say, is it's a lot more accessible to engage with the stuff that in previous Souls games you would have never been able to see unless you were a Souls head.
I mean, I think one thing to say, I think before you get into what you're about to say next, is that this game is fucking big. I think like we are used to like kind of checkpoint open world stuff, and this game is like sort of that a little bit, but like they just made a fucking huge fantasy world with like secrets galore and stories and like tons of stuff in a way that I think, I mean, I said this at the start, this might be one of the best games ever. Like they did the thing. They like did the thing that this they did the thing that we talked about Cyberpunk trying to do, which was like Cyberpunk was like, we're gonna make a whole city. And that didn't really work out. This game was like, we're gonna make a whole fantasy world. And most people say that and they don't, or they cut a lot of corners. Like this cuts no corners, as far as I can tell so far. And in fact, it like not only doesn't cut corners, it makes new corners for itself in fucking crazy ways.
Let's talk
That is
about
just
that
like,
a little bit more,
but
because
yeah.
I
was just going to preface that to say what you were about to say, where it was like more accessible. Because I think my only point to that was that like it's more accessible in the sense that like it is hard to not play this game and not run into like random cool shit. I think there's a way
yes,
in like the Souls games before where like you have to do the right thing to get the cool stuff,
yeah,
and in this game you can just sort of stumble around and have a good time.
yeah.
That was my extended
No,
preface to the notion of
totally.
accessibility.
I mean, it feels much more like Breath of the Wild in that way, where it's just like
Yeah.
everything is. And what's interesting is there's something to be said about the design, which is that it doesn't feel like the game is super like packed, jam packed with just random shit.
Yeah.
Like there's a good amount of empty space in this game, to the point where some of it feels like almost jarringly like Shadow of the Colossus-y, where you're just riding a horse around a really big field and like, oh, this is really pretty. But then you'll kind of stumble across something that's like a little weird, and then you dig further into it, and it's it unravels into this huge thing to experience that is just something totally different than what you were expecting. There's a lot of really cheeky stuff. There's a lot of FromSoft shenanigans where they're fucking with you. It does feel like Hidetaka Miyazaki is laughing at me a lot when I'm playing this game. And FromSoft is just like messing with your head. But what I wanted to talk about with the way that the world looks and the design and the corners that it's not cutting, we got to talk about the art design, the art direction, and just the way that this game looks, because it's something that has gotten lost in the fact that I've played this game so much, but there is no game that has come closer to looking like art than this.
Yeah, I think that the sort of initial like promotional screenshots and videos of this game really didn't do this game any favors in this regard, where a lot of the initial stuff you see is this like big fucking like holographic looking tree in the background, which looks gaudy as hell. And don't worry, it never stops looking gaudy as hell. It's like ridiculous the whole time. But like it's this like weird like oversaturated blue and purple thing to like contrast the tree, and it looks like bad. But then the game does this like very sort of aggressive, like almost like World of Warcraft style, like zone and color shifting, where you'll like be playing and it'll be like that sort of weird like purple, blue, yellow thing, but then it will like switch, and then you get some of this like painting shit where like they turn on the right tone mapping and you're like, whoa, this looks really good. And it's like kind of staggering because it, especially off that initial stuff, you don't necessarily realize it's going to be like a very pretty game. But then you get to these points, like Josh is pulling up some, it looks like sort of impressionist paintings, some
like
pastoral
baroque landscape art. And
it's got this
is like exactly what this game looks like. Like it looks like
it's got some like real nice stuff.
And like, let's make a game look like this. It's got this
I think
dreamy quality.
It does this thing where I think that this is like sort of technical, but like in games, if something exists and you can see it, there's light on it. So there's never any like you can't have like black or like really dark elements in a game without having some light source. So like imagine you have a light source in like a scene or a painting or whatever. For something to be sort of seen at all in the scope of a video game, you have to have a light on it. What this typically means is that like the dark black colors in video games are often like washed out because of the way that they do their like lighting. And like this game is so good at doing very dark colors with a lot of nuance that I think gives this whole image this like painting contrast style where like the darks are like very dark, but you can still resolve detail. Like walking into a cave in this game, like it feels dark. Like you walk into a fucking cave in Skyrim and it's like still kind of bright or whatever. Like you can go in a cave in this game and it's like a dark ass cave. And I think that something about like that kind of weaves into what you're talking about, Josh. We're just like the way they're able to sort of pull contrast out of the landscape gives it this sort of like painterly quality. Yeah, like right here, you're just in fucking dark. Like it gives it this sort of painterly quality that makes the whole game have this like impressionistic feel, which is like truly like really pretty. Like it looks really good, especially like in contrast to like the fucking like rainbow throw up of like Horizon Forbidden West and Zero Dawn. Like those games are just like explosive bright colors, which is like great in its own way. But there's like a subtlety to the way this game looks that makes like every single shot just be like, damn, this is kind of pretty. Like this looks good.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. It's art. It really evokes that sense that it's at least taken inspiration from like oil paintings and art. And it's not like it just tried to they just put an effect on everything that made it look like an oil painting, which is what a lot of games do. Where it's like, oh, let's make it look like it's smudging oil as if there was actually made from oil paint. It's like, no, what if we tried to actually emulate the artistic details of what an oil painting landscape is trying to capture? And that is just so much more compelling to me. And boss being shown here. I'm gonna just skip it. But yeah, I mean, if you just look at how art direction in video games has worked over the past couple decades too, we had the whole everything is brown issue with art, where it was like, this is gross. Why is every game so brown and just disgusting? And then as a response, they were just like, let's just make everything colorful. And you get like Rage 2, that's just like brown, but with like a bunch of neon purple everywhere randomly. And then Horizon Zero Dawn, where it's like everything is just cloyingly oversaturated. This is just, what if we just tried to make the whole world look like something that a baroque artist might have conceived or tried to depict, and the entire world is created with that. And that to me is one of the things that keeps me coming back to this game, is that sense of just seeing these new landscapes and having something to kind of peel back and look even deeper into there, because it is gorgeous. It's a gorgeous game.
It reminds me too of like some of the stuff that we talked about with like Breath of the Wild when it first come out, which is about, remember the time we started the podcast. Kind of like talking about how Breath of the Wild was really exceptional, obviously in a lot of different ways. One of the main ones being that it sort of like took these kind of barely alluded to concepts and like in previous Zelda games, like Hyrule Field and like the, Zora's Domain or whatever, which on like Game Boy or like the NES or even Ocarina of Time are like small rooms. And what it does is actually like, no, Zora's Domain is like fucking giant waterfall canyon with this like beautiful, like it kind of took these concepts and sort of brought them to like an actual interesting narrative point. And manifested in the world, like to the scale, like Death Mountain is a giant, huge volcanic mountain in Breath of the Wild. And that is not the case in previous Zelda games, but you're kind of led to believe it is. I think that sort of in line with the sort of aesthetic is something that Elden Ring does, which is take sort of similar fantasy concepts and like actually give you kind of like you've always thought about, this sort of fantasy style thing. Like, well, what if that's just a thing? Like the whole first fucking main area, Stormvale Castle, is like, you want to go fucking run around a big ass fantasy castle. That's like a real castle. And just like the whole situation that you can go explore and whatever. You want to go, I don't want to say anymore because there's a lot of other stuff like that that's sort of spoilery, but like
it still has, what's nice about that too is that you're not just looking at that stuff. Like there's still just so much weird shit to be encountered in those spaces that you would just never conceive.
Yeah. And they like, I think they sort of like subvert it as well, where they're like it's a Souls game. They're not just going to give you like, like fucking Godric, right? Like you're not just going to get like some like corrupted knight. Like most games would stop at corrupted knight, and they would just, but this game goes much further.
Just truly demented shit in this game.
Yeah. And I think it's cool where they just like show, like they just take these sort of concepts that other games, like I'm even thinking of like, I was playing The Witcher 3 for a little bit before I started playing Sekiro and now playing Elden Ring. And even like The Witcher 3, for like as much as it's like acclaimed, like you're at the castle in like Vizima and you get the like courtyard and like a few rooms leading up to wherever the fuck, I forget, the Nilfgaardian prince is like there or whatever. And it's like sort of a castle, but it's mostly just a lot of big rooms. This is like, no, it's a fucking castle. Like Stormvale Castle is as big as like 2 or 3 standard Souls areas. Like it is a fucking huge castle that you have to like run around and fight stuff in. And there are parts that you like can't get to or whatever, but most of the stuff that you can see, like you can get to, and it is like huge and big. And there's like servants' quarters, and there's like a chef's room where they presumably they prepare the food, and there's like a church on the grounds, and there's like battlements, and there's like all the stuff. Like Elden Ring kind of is the first game that I've really played that really teases that stuff out to say like, okay, well, like we're in a fantasy world and we're operating at a certain scale. So if we're operating at this scale and the world is explorable, we're going to give you all of these things, which is just sort of fucking insane. All that to say too, I think that sort of marries really well with the sense of aesthetics, where they're really kind of channeling this, yeah, like Renaissance Baroque kind of vibe for the art that has typically depicted these like sorts of scenes and legends. So just say like, yeah, you can, that painting that you really like that shows this kind of crazy like castle on a hill, like that is a place you can go to the point literally inside of Elden Ring there's like Breath of the Wild style like memory, like there's basically paintings in the game. This is not really a spoiler. That you like get the art of, and you have to go like find the area that looks like the painting. So even just from that perspective, right? There's a sort of reflexive understanding of, hey, our game looks like a painting to the extent that we are literally going to have paintings in game of our world that you have to go see and like line up.
Yeah. Yeah. I there's also a horse in this game, which we talked about this with Sekiro too. But that game like introduced this sense of verticality and movement that was executed so well. It was like, okay, y'all just decided let's make a game that feels totally different than our previous games, and it's gonna be splendid. It's gonna feel just as good. And the horseback stuff in this is same, where it's like, how did you kill it so hard?
It feels so good. It's like it's staggering how good the horse feels in this game. I think in part because like it's not really, I mean, it's not a real horse in multiple senses. It is neither a real like horse that is like, it's just like a spectral steed or something, but also the way the horse controls is like very unrealistic in some ways.
It's very
but
tight.
like,
yeah, it's not like a Red Dead horse where
yeah, no, it's not like driving a fucking boat. Like you're on this thing, but it's so good, right? Like to not have to micromanage where your horse is at. You just summon it and then you pop off of it. Makes you engage with the horse mechanics so much more. I'm like a fucking brain broke gamer, so I am like so scared to like get on a horse and run across an open world because I know there's going to be stuff that I miss. So it works perfectly for me who wants to get on a horse, ride for like 5 seconds, then get off again. And the fact there's like almost no friction between those two moments is like lovely. It's exactly what I need.
yeah. Yeah, and then there's just cool characters to encounter, really interesting side stuff that is very it's very clearly presented in front of you to a surprising extent, where I'm just like, oh, I get to engage with a side quest in a FromSoft game, and I don't have to like find some NPC behind 10 hidden walls in quick succession. Like, what is this? I'm able to see side characters' stories through to their logical conclusion without having to look in a strategy guide, which is just really cool. And I also have a weirdly strong sense of place and direction in this game, despite the fact that it's so huge. I can kind of think about a character that I met like 10 hours ago and be like, oh, I know they're over here. And I could like know the closest site of grace. I could almost think of the entire map in my head without like referring back to it.
This is the thing. Like, I feel like this game feels like so much of a place.
Yeah.
I think that like it's weird because even in something like Breath of the Wild, like, or other open world genre games, like the worlds are so like designed where they're like, there's some like cuteness to them that like makes them feel like these little like play palaces or whatever. And something about like Elden Ring feels like totally organic, and obviously it's like a design space, but it's not like it just feels like a place. And so you're like, oh yeah, that the guy that sells the weapons is over there next to that shack. And I remember going there because I was passing by like this cliff face on the way to this castle, and like it just kind of loops in your brain, and it's distinct enough too where it's not like, oh, what was like the one, like I think Red Dead has this problem a little bit where like a lot of the landscape is very similar, so it's sort of hard to have like spatial mappings of places in your head to places that are in the game. this like Elden Ring is like in some ways the landscape is like very unnatural, like the way the formations of like the land and geologic stuff works, but it's enough to the point where it feels like a real sort of place that makes it easier to just remember shit. You're like, oh yeah, I could like you can like plot me somewhere in Limgrave and I would know how to get to any one point based on where I'm at because of the geography of the place, which is like fucking crazy, honestly. Like that's not an easy thing to do, and to have done that is like, I mean, it's incredible. It
I
really
think there's a
is.
lot to be said as well for the way that it soulsifies spaces. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when you experience trauma or any sort of adversity, it's
The
much
body
easier
keeps
to
the score.
remember like the spaces in which those things occurred.
I think that's true. Yeah.
And it's like the opening field of Limgrave. It's like, that's where I fought the tree sentinel. Or, oh, this field is where this group of enemies was that I died to like twice. Or this is where I fought those little weird monkey guys who jumped out of a bush and one-shot me. Or like, this is where I fought that crazy dragon. And they are able to correlate these massive spaces with these creatures that you either you have to deal with in some way, whether you sneak by them or you ride around them or whatever it is. You have a sense of what that space is because your brain automatically associates the danger there with that space. And I think that's helping me to get a better sense of what's in an area. But it also has this added neat effect, which is one of the cooler, I think, parts of the loop within Souls games that this game has a little bit of an extra kind of spice added to it, which is the feeling of when you beat a specific enemy that is patrolling a space or something, and when you beat that enemy and you're able to just freely explore that area is one of the best feelings in a Souls game, because you're like, I know that there's some fucking treats in this church, or I know that there's some cool shit in this area that I wasn't able to look around before because there was this big scary guy, but now I can because I killed it. I got strong enough to kill it. And every area is filled with its own rewards that you, once you kill the thing that was guarding it, you can kind of just freely explore. And every area becomes its own prepackaged experience because it has that arc, that little storyline within the space.
There's meaning to every space is sort of what you're saying. Like, I think that there are places that are like kind of what you were describing earlier in the podcast about big open spaces, but you don't get like Skyrim or Morrowind style big open spaces because it's hard to make content. I think that when you get those spaces in Elden Ring, like there's sort of this like thematic meaning to them as open spaces that is, again, not like a cut corner, because as much as there might be open space, there's also stuff that's like very dense. So I think that what happens is that like I'm trying to like I'm halfway through to a quarter of the way through the second zone, but most of my time in the game, I'm like, I think I just cracked 30 hours. I spent like 20 hours just in Limgrave, like just kind of running around, and like I think I've done most everything in there. But like at first glance, you can kind of run from like the southern part to the northern part of Limgrave in like, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, maybe like 10 minutes, just if you're on horseback.
Mm-hmm.
But like there's like 20 hours worth of shit just like inside that area, which is staggering and huge and like kind of insane. But I think that like what that means is that like there's like so few places in the game where you aren't having like some meaningful interaction or discovery or battle or something, such to the point that like no exploration feels like it's just exploring. Or, I mean, it is exploring, but it's never kind of unproductive. I think like Breath of the Wild is an amazing game. I love that game. I did love the fact that around every kind of hidden corner was like a Korok seed, and they kind of anticipated that. But I think even beyond that, like I can't remember in Breath of the Wild where like every Korok seed is at, but I know for certain where crazy places I got to just in Limgrave and Elden Ring were, because I got something that was like an Ash of War, which was like could totally change your weapon style. I got a cool new weapon. There was a cool boss. Like in terms of the stuff they give you as a reward for exploration, there are so few places where it doesn't feel meaningful to just fucking scrape or like kind of comb through every area, like almost like you're a search party, like because there's just so much stuff everywhere. And that kind of like repetition of like motion across like the face of a geography, like it kind of encodes it into your mind, right? Like you're remembering what the space is and where all these things are at, because so much of the place has been kind of imbued with meaning that comes from discovery or challenge or trauma. Like there's just so much stuff there where like even now as I'm saying this, I feel like I could like draw a map of Limgrave from my memory and show you like, oh, this is where this person's at. This is where this battle is. This is where this mine's at. This is where this catacomb's at. This is where like I just know it in my head now. And what's cool about that, and the last thing I'll say on this point is that like there are like sort of souls, like classic souls style like loop paths that kind of loop back on each other, especially in places like Stormvale. But for the most part, this is an open world. So like you're not going to get a lot of that sort of like, oh shit, I like mentally connected these pathways in my mind to like a physical space. Um, which was such a huge part of Dark Souls, which was like, oh, all these the space is interconnected, and I kind of like understand this how to traverse this space because of the way it connects to itself. I think that same sort of outcome is manifested in Elden Ring, but instead of doing this sort of like looping level design structure, it comes down to the fact where like they put stuff everywhere so that the whole space becomes meaningful and like you remember it, which was such a huge thing in like the Souls games. So they're able to kind of apply that same final outcome, but to a kind of world and like map design that in some ways is like antithetical to what they were really good at, or what they still are good at, which was this sort of like looping level design structure.
But it is really impressive to me that they were able to translate that in such a
Mm-hmm.
massive way. Like I still get that sense after so much time playing this game that I can every area that I go to I can kind of remember almost like the back of my hand after only having
Yeah.
gone through it one time. And a lot of it is because it's just such an intense space in which to exist. I think Zelda Breath of the Wild, for instance, it's like so much of that game is about the journey and the experience of traveling and getting somewhere else. Like you get that the glider and stuff,
Yeah.
and you have a horse, and it's about going from place to place and taking this grand journey. And the sense of scale is kind of what's amazing about it. There's not as much detail when you really drill in. But yeah, this game feels like every challenge has just some novel, weird thing about it, some quirk to it that is just really memorable. And it feels packed to the brim with that sort of creative juice.
It's like it's so dense. Like it's fucking crazy. Like I think that I read somewhere that they've been working on this since they were working on. So they were working on this while they were working on Sekiro, and I think that like the answer is that they've just been working on this for a super long time. Like you just don't. I feel like you just cannot get this density of stuff in like a 2 or 3 year development timeline. Like this has been. It's crazy. Like, did you find? This is not a spoiler. I'm just gonna say a name. It's like Siofra, Siofra.
Yes, I did.
Like the implications of that are wild. And you're like, what? Like, excuse me? Like, there's just stuff in this game where you're like, how is this game so big? And I think that, like, that's like such a fucking gamer thing to talk about because it's like everyone says they've got like the biggest game, but like, really, like, you're just doing the same thing over and over and over. Like, in Elden Ring, you are still fighting stuff, but the nature of what you're doing and how the fight is happening is like changing sort of pretty fundamentally, like pretty consistently. that is just like I'm just like in awe. I'm like, this game is so big and it's so consistently good, and the tone is so like perfectly nailed consistently that it is just crazy to play. It's like they just did it. They fucking nailed it. This is like a 10 out of 10 game. Like there's so little wrong with this game, and even what is wrong is like so minor or whatever that it like doesn't fucking matter. It's like they fucking nailed it. Like they I can't imagine a version of this game that is better than what it is right now.
Yeah.
It's fucking nuts.
I want to. I know that it's the discussion about difficulty is trad. I know that it's annoying to have to talk about this, but there's been a lot of discussion about accessibility in this game recently, and I'm like, I want to talk about really quickly the differences between difficulty and accessibility, because I feel like there's been a weird conflation of those things where people talk about accessibility in this game, and I'm just like, what are we talking about here anymore? Even why are we talking about accessibility with regards to Elden Ring? Are we talking about like colorblind options? Are we talking about input options and whatnot? Like,
yeah, there's like a conflation between like accessibility features like remapping controls and colorblind modes, and that with like accessibility
being able
in the
to
sense
pause,
of how
I think,
easy
is
something is to
something
get
that people are
into.
talking
Or
about
yeah,
as an
being able to
accessibility
pause.
issue. And it's like, first off, I think we have this tendency, especially in American society right now, to talk about just products as if, like, I guess that we talk about like the game not having a pause button as if it's just like profoundly like cruel to people who need the ability to pause a game. Which, okay, I agree. Like, it's probably somewhat, there's definitely some lack of consideration there. There's probably something about that is like rude and or like offensive to people who like, for whom a pause function would really, really make the play experience a lot more doable, because they have some sort of, I don't know, whether they have some sort of condition or something that makes it so that pause would like be really helpful for them. But I think there's definitely a line between that and just being like so just a terrible person's game. Like, you're a terrible person for enjoying this game, or like the people who made this are like total assholes or something, you know? This is difficult to talk about, I think. I guess something I would compare this to is, like, I was at a Japanese restaurant last night with a friend who's gluten-free, and it was like, I thought it was a shabu shabu place, and I was like, oh, let's go to this place because, yeah, like, gluten-free, like shabu shabu, you're just like putting some meat in a pot. Except it turned out like every sauce had gluten. Most of the broths, even the like pork-based broth, had gluten in it. It was just like nuts. And it was just like, I don't think they were assholes because there was no gluten-free option. And like, they probably could have done more to consider those types of guests. But there's like a line between that and like making an essay about why Japanese restaurants have accessibility issues or something like that. You know?
I think it's like I think along the lines of like that sort of accessibility, like there's stuff that could be done. Like, I think there are, like, especially I think something like Forza, that like it's crazy sort of crazy good accessibility options is like really great. But I also think that a lot of that stuff like sort of does come down to genre. Like, you know what else doesn't have pause? Online matches in Call of Duty. Like, every single multiplayer first person shooter, you cannot pause when you're playing online. That is the same case with Elden Ring. It is an online game. So, I mean, you can turn the online off. Should you be able to pause when you're not online? sure, whatever. But I think that there's a way where there's like it could be a lot better, and I do think that like stuff like that would go really far. But also, yeah, like I don't know, I understand that complaining about this stuff is a way to get those changes to happen, but I also think there is like some of that stuff sort of dips into like authorship and like the ability and like the mystique of a kind of a persistent world is like part of the vibe of the game.
I've
I don't
I
think that like also like what I will say too on the note of pausing, like you can't pause during a boss battle, whatever. But like there are plenty of places in the game where you can just go hang out for a second if you have to like do something. I think like not being able to pause in crucial moments is like annoying, but also like if you are someone who's played Souls games or like someone who is like mad about this in Souls games and don't understand, let me tell you, dying doesn't matter, especially in Elden Ring. Like you couldn't pause and you died, it's probably okay. Like you can go get your souls again and then run out there and then go do pick up the thing that you were doing. I think that like I feel like you're alluding to some discourse that I haven't been totally privy to, but for better or for worse. But I definitely think that when it comes to stuff like accessibility, like it would be nice to have more features in games to make it more available to other people. But it is also weird right now because like that sort of discourse morphing with the like just normal difficulty slash accessibility or ease of playing a game for new people discourse that dogs every Souls game, that stuff is kind of like merging. I think
yeah,
in part
that's
because
what
of the fact that like the like I said this on the Discord as well, where like I think people like fell for the Elden Ring meme where like they're like, oh, it's an easier Souls game or whatever. Kind of the same way like I bought Monster Hunter because people were like, this is the good one. And I played it and I was like, it's still fucking Monster Hunter. Like it's still like this is still a Souls game, right? Like and I think people kind of bought it expecting like not that stuff. And it's like, sorry, like this is it's still the thing that it is on the box. Like it's not I think even like the reports of this game being easier are much exaggerated.
well I think
It's like
because I mean it goes the opposite way too, which is that we have talked about it as being more accessible, this game, because
yeah,
you can experience more of it without having to resort to things like strategy guides and stuff like that. So I guess it's almost, it makes sense that it would come back to bite you in the ass, and for it to be like, well, this game still isn't accessible because the first boss is so hard to beat, and it's like,
yeah,
well, like, let's take a step back, because that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about accessibility. And yeah, I don't know. I just don't think that, I think we should take care not to conflate those two things. And yeah, I do think that there should be more accessibility features in games straight up, and there should be some in this game too, but it's like, if it doesn't have those features, it's just a game that's like missing features, and you can criticize it for that. But I don't know like how far that should reach, like how far that extends, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's kind of a weird thing. But
yeah, it's like I think that there are definitely I mean, I think that generally like how do you approach like I think something like Forza makes a lot of sense for having a lot of accessibility features because of the nature of the type of game that is. It's on a track. I guess well, Horizon's not quite on a track, but it's like you're driving around a car and the actual points of interaction are really low. You basically have a gas wheel and like a driving stick, the left analog stick. Like so much of this game is about very precise execution on a controller with like a lot of different configurations where like the accessibility like the sort of accessibility angle for that type of gameplay is kind of like a genre would have to be like a genre reinvention. Now, I think that someone like FromSoft could potentially be like up to the task for that, and I think that actually something like Sekiro is maybe a little bit more sort of accessible in that way, in the sense that the actual execution stuff is like a little the timing still really matters, but like in like this game, right? Like every sort of button performs a very crucial function for how you operate your character. And I think that, like, if we want to talk about accessibility in Souls games, like, I think you have to sort of start there. And I'm not totally sure that like FromSoft is willing to sacrifice kind of like character fidelity of action for like a simplified control set, or Sekiro is as far as they'll go in that angle. But also, like, I don't know. It's a hard problem. I do feel for people who want to engage with these games but are blocked out because of accessibility features on that end. I think that I'm not talking about people who are mad because the games are hard. I think that, like, yeah, if you have a really hard problem with like dexterous maneuvering of your fingers, but you really want to like explore a dark fantasy world, like, it sucks you can't play these games, and it sucks there's not a good answer for that. But also, I don't think that like FromSoft is like, the worst person in the world because that stuff doesn't exist. Um, the easy thing, or like the accessibility via gameplay, I think is a different conversation. We could talk about a little bit.
I don't know
Um,
what the right like stance is here. I don't know where the correct position to have myself is here, because I also think it's obnoxious when people are like, that's what Souls is all about. Like, is that it's hard.
yeah,
Like, that's the whole point of the game, man. And you're like messing up. Asking for an easy mode is like asking for the fucking hit, like, Picasso to change his fucking what his
yeah,
art
like, that's
looks
bullshit. Like, I think this sort of idea that like these games have to be this way. I think that like FromSoft especially has, even just inside the scope of the games they've done, they've shown that they are down for like pretty big changes of
Well,
stuff. Like, there's
there
there's
was
no
this.
weapon durability, right? Like, that's a big
Did
deal.
you read that Simon Parkin essay? Like, I think there was some interview that I saw where
The Miyazaki interview?
was talking about like
Yeah.
how he doesn't think that the game should be made any easier. So it looks like it's something that they're not willing to really compromise on, which I don't know. It's like, I'm not mad about that. I also don't see what
So
the
just to be
big
clear, you're
deal
talking about
would be.
accessibility from like a ease of gameplay difficulty angle. We've moved on from like hard to control and like no pause menu, and now you're talking
I mean,
about,
for me, it's like, it's self-evident that like you could always have more accessibility
yes,
options on that
I
front.
agree.
And
Yeah.
I wouldn't budge on that. I wouldn't say like the game should never try to cater to people who have different needs
Mhm.
based on that stuff. I just think that the argument has taken this weirdly disingenuous turn where it's becoming more like, if the game's not easy, then it's not considerate toward people who have those types of issues with playing the game,
Mhm. Gotcha.
as opposed to the real conversation, which is just like, the game is not easy enough for some people, which is worth discussing also, but I think is not like, you're not, that conversation should not take place on the same terms on which a conversation about missing those types of, features about, quote, real accessibility are concerned with. And I don't know, I guess one thing I want to talk about though is that like, this game kind of does have an easy mode, or at least an easier mode, which is that like, you just fucking walk around and do stuff that's not fighting a boss for like a few more hours.
I want to just interrupt you because I prompted our Discord for some questions because I told them we're recording about Elden Ring. So we can talk about what you're about to talk about
Yeah.
through the lens of these questions because it's relevant.
Yeah.
Someone asks, is this game too big? And they also asked, is this the most accessible Souls game? So just to start answering some questions, I think that what you're talking about. So you're saying like, there's a way that the game has an easy mode, which is just turn around and go somewhere else.
Yes.
Yeah. I think
I feel like the
ahead.
difficulty curve is like, it's a cliff if you go to the difficulty cliff, but you can just like walk up the backside of the difficulty hill. That's totally an option. And you can always grind more, and it will invariably make fights easier for you.
I sort of like, so something related to this was something that we talked about on the Discord. Sorry to keep bringing that up, but if you join us, patreon.com/badend, we have a great Discord where we talk about all sorts of stuff. One big conversation we had was about the question I just prompted Josh with, which was that, is this game too big? I think that the game is not too big, but I do think, I think Jumplust was the person to say this on the Discord, that the sort of size of this game, I think, introduces issues with the formula in a way that I think is both is like, I think it's aligned with what you're saying, Josh, about an easy mode, but my sort of like ungenerous opinion is that you got to kind of put your time in for a Souls game. You got to like, you got to get good. Like you have to just learn what it means to like, you have to like learn what boss movement is. You have to sort of, you have to like watch a boss and understand like movement patterns, the ways things move, understand that you're even looking for that at all, understand like just the way like a boss battle works, and like understand how your stamina interacts with like your shielding and stuff. And I think there's a way where, yes, if you feel like something is too hard in this game, you can turn around. But like spoilers, you're going to run into something else that's really hard. And actually, in some cases, harder for different reasons. And I think like there's a way, like we were talking about Dark Souls 1, where in Dark Souls 1, you sort of start and like I forget what it's called, Undead Asylum. And then you kind of fight low level trash mobs leading up to the Asylum demon. And you have to kill the Asylum demon before you get to go to I forget what it's called. Not the Undead Burg, the like first bonfire in Dark Souls. Like you have to fight the Asylum demon flat out. Like you just have to do that. And I think there's like something about that loop where like you're going to die to the Asylum demon. Like you're going to die to that. And you're going to respawn, and then you're going to work through again the first 6 or 7 skeletons, then fight the Asylum demon again and probably die. And you kind of keep doing this pattern. And like, this is just the grind of Dark Souls. It's just getting your fucking ass beat until you realize what you're looking for. And I think there's a way where if you're not like brain broke like I am against these games, that you like get to someone like Magritte, or you get to someone like the cat we were just showing on the YouTube video, and you're like, fuck this, I'm going somewhere else. But you can't say fuck this, I'm going somewhere else to every single boss in the game. Like eventually you have to fight and beat one. And by deferring that, you sort of, I worry that, and I've seen this like happen on Twitter, where people are just getting like so burned on the game because they're like, everything is hard and everything is difficult. And on one hand, I'm like, that, yeah, that's the thing. But also you have to like, you do have to learn how to do this thing. Like you can't take this like masterclass style Cliff Notes version of like playing a Souls game and kind of like just go get the best of stuff. Like if you're going to play it, like you can fight fucking Godric soldiers till the like sun goes down, but eventually you do have to fight a boss. And what's I think hard about this game is that until you like just recognize that part of playing a Souls game is just throwing yourself at a body and just dying a lot, like you're not going to have a good time with this game. And I think that the other games that are sort of slightly more linear or much more linear than this game force that on you, where they're like, you have to beat Gascony. You just have to do it. And like, it's going to suck and it's going to be hard, but like you're going to do it and you're going to feel great and you're going to feel more confident to move forward. And I think what's hard right now about Elden Ring is that like, if you don't already have that built in and know that that's the loop, and you've heard based on our podcast talk that this game's more accessible, you go somewhere else. Like, where the fuck are you going to go, Josh? You're going to go fight the dragon in the lake. You're going to go fight the cat in the catacombs. You're going to go fight the giants on the, like, there's no, you can go like to the forest and fight Godric soldiers, but like everything else around there is like really difficult.
There's just,
so I think there's like,
some
there's
stuff
something
that's like marginally more doable, and some of which is like a lot more doable that will still yield you some sense of progress. But you're right that at some point you're going to hit a hard wall. And I think, but I want to use this, I guess, opportunity to kind of talk about what I think the kind of crux of the issue here is. and it's this sort of center point for the difficulty conversation. And I think the artistic, the artistic, again, to say crux of what these games are doing is that Souls games in general, and Elden Ring is no exception, are primarily games that are meant to make you feel shitty. And
or like
this is,
or
I
to
think
feel great after feeling shitty.
This is why these games are just simply not for everyone. Like, no, but people over exaggerate the feeling good part, overcoming the challenge shit. That's not what you're there for.
It's fleeting. It is very fleeting.
People are like, oh yeah, I fought this boss for 5 hours, and when I finally beat him, it made it all worth it. No, that's not what the fucking game is about. The boss is not about the 10 seconds of elation you feel when you beat the boss. These games are about making you feel hopeless. They're about making you feel gross. They're about feeling disgusting. They're about like making you fear what you do not know and what you haven't seen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes them strong adventure games, is that like you always fear what's around the corner. It instills that sense of trauma, which allows you to memorize this world like the back of your hand. And I think when it comes to difficulty,
it's fucking insane. I'm like watching the YouTube video right now when you said that, and I know exactly where this person's at despite not watching this video for the past 15 minutes. It's fucking crazy.
It's an interesting thing. But I mean, the difficulty is one vehicle through which they instill that sense within you.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of the game works toward those same ends. And I don't think it benefits us to act like it doesn't, because while this game does have a bit more, I guess, pleasant of an environment, it's easier to exist in this space. It's slightly less oppressive. It still is like you are still always on your way to something that is going to make you feel shitty.
Yeah.
And you know it. You have this looming sense of dread inside you. And if you find that feeling to be unattractive, to be repulsive, to be something that you don't want to partake in, no tweak to the difficulty is going to change that.
Yeah.
And I think when people talk about difficulty in this game, that's ultimately what they're talking about, is that feeling that like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. And at a certain point, like, you just have to say like, okay, that's it. There's no fucking pot of gold waiting for you around the corner. There's no beautiful game that you haven't, there's no bright and inviting world waiting for you around the corner if you could only beat this one hard boss. No, it's always going to be that. That's what this whole game is about. And I think it's like such a dumb thing. I was talking to a friend of mine about this. Like, I'm sort of anti summoning people for like boss fights. I just like fucking get off on doing it myself because I'm weird like that. But like, there's like, the Souls games are the only games where I like beat them and feel like I actually accomplished something and didn't just like do the right Skinner box. Like, there's like every single fucking video game that's not a Souls game, like I would say almost unilaterally, like they are designed for you to beat them, and you are supposed to feel powerful as a player, and you'll get through it and it'll be mostly fine. It might be hard at some points, but like you're gonna do it and you'll be fine and you're the victor and everyone loves you. Like, Dark Souls does not give a fuck about you. And I think it's sort of like cool that that's the case for these games where it's like, you want to go be a hero, go play fucking Dragon Age. Like, you want to be a hero, go play The Witcher. You go be the big best boy or girl and like do your big adventure and everyone's going to love you. And these games are like, no, it's fucking hard. And like, you're going to get to the end of this game, like you really fucking did something. Like, maybe you spent 80 hours of your life sitting in front of a TV fighting like ones and zeros, but like it feels good to like beat these things. It's like, shit, like that was fucking hard. And it's like, I know it's like just a video game or whatever, but like you talk to someone else who's like progressed far in these games, and there's like a real, I'm like getting chills talking about this. Such a loser. Like, there's a real sort of camaraderie. Like, I met a friend at a party
who had played Bloodborne, and we were just like fucking shooting off about like these experiences we had in this incredibly difficult game, probably shared trauma, like you're talking about, of like these things that we did that were sort of like comparable to each other because we both got to a certain extent. And I think that like that's the power of these games. That's like why like the Souls memes all hit so different, because you're like, fuck, like you know the person who made that meme got like as far as you did, such that like you have this sort of shared experience that feels unique because you know not everyone can do it. Like everyone gets the end of Mass Effect. It's not a hard thing to do. So like just seeing like a meme at the end of Mass Effect is basically like saying, "Oh, I played a game for 25 hours or something." Like you see a meme about like the end of Dark Souls and you're like, "Fuck, that feels really meaningful because someone else was there and like went through all the same shit that I did and got their ass beat over and over and over enough that we can kind of have this like same experience and reflect and laugh on this thing that kind of happened at the end." And like I'm sort of with Miyazaki, like you make the games easier and like that goes away. You make the games easier and like it's cool, it's like a fun story or whatever, but there's something about that like actual struggle that's like really hard. It presents like a real
As
it's like a real
someone
challenge,
as
you know?
someone who has not beaten a lot of these games and quit due to not wanting to fucking play this shit anymore, I think that it's not just that like we shouldn't make the game harder anymore. It's also like people should also just be more okay with like not finishing a game or like
Yeah.
not experiencing everything a game has to offer. And I feel like Elden Ring is offering that in a different way, which is like this game is so fucking huge that like at a certain point, like you should just be content with just seeing what parts of it that you want to see and letting the culture have those experiences at a larger level, because that is where the meaning of these games comes from. That's where the subtext comes from, is having different stories to tell about how you experienced that thing. And that's what's always been literary to me about these games, is these spaces that you can never fill. And which I talked about at the beginning of this episode with regards to what the worlds look like. But it's also there in the difficulty too of like, I've never beaten Dark Souls, but I know a lot about their worlds, and the fact that I kind of learned them through this sort of secondhand primary sources of people who have beaten these games. And I've watched the videos of people who learned everything there is to learn about the lore, who wrote down all of the item descriptions and took everything that there was to know about them and applied them to what they gleaned from the environmental storytelling that they had seen. It makes the game bigger than what it is, and it is what makes these games so special in large part. Do I think that that means that the difficulty is like there should never ever be a compromise on it? Not necessarily, but at the same time, it's like, personally, I think that it's like fine to just play a couple hours of one of these things and say, you know, it's not really for me, and just enjoy it kind of secondhand through other people and take from these experiences what you will, because there's still a lot there to see. And that, I think, is especially the case with Elden Ring. Is one of the things that I'm really digging about this game, is like, I feel like I'm not I think I'm going to have a second playthrough, which personally kind of feels like a must if you want to see everything in this game. I don't know if I have a fucking second playthrough in me, but I also think that that's fine. And like, I think it would be cooler to learn more about this game through my friends. Like, this has been one of the biggest communal gaming experiences I've had since like Animal Crossing. You know, everybody is coming to the Superculture / Bad End Discord and talking about this thing. We're all thinking about it when we're not playing it. It's just that kind of game. Like, it gets lodged into your head and you want to know more about its world and what's going on. And I think a lot of people I've noticed too are much more okay with people, quote, spoiling stuff about the game, because it's like, I just want to talk about it. I want to hear more about it. I want to like experience more about it and talk about my experience in this world. And a lot of hearing about it from other people is like just as cool as experiencing it yourself, which which is not something I would want to see as a negative thing. Like, you don't need to be able to experience it all yourself. That's not really the point.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I don't want to like swing a dick around being like, oh, you're just not good enough at video games, bro. Like, it's not, there's some space in between there. And I think that Souls, like, to get the most out of Souls, it helps you to be okay with the way that you are going to experience Souls, to kind of get that sense of confidence in how you're experiencing it. Not like you're getting the incorrect Souls experience or what have you. Like, I still feel fine having not beaten Dark Souls. I will feel fine if I never beat Dark Souls in my life, despite how influential of a game it is. I feel like I've had a good experience, and I've played enough of that game to like feel comfortable in what I know about it. I don't feel like I need to beat the last boss to like be able to engage with the conversation or culture that surrounds that game, because like it should. But it, on the other hand, it should be okay within the conversation to talk about this game as someone who like hasn't beaten it. It's like, it's about every way of interacting with the game is valid, I would say. And that's always been the case with Souls games. Like, so many people don't beat these things and yet still talk about
like
them.
You look at the like fucking percentages of like PlayStation trophies, and it's like, oh, like I think it's like Bloodborne, it was like 30% of people beat Gascony, and it's like, what? Like,
the first boss.
That's like the first boss.
Yeah.
Like, I think to your point, like, I guess like something about like the difficulty of the games, I think, is also a little bit overstated. Like, I think that if you come into a Dark Souls game and you're expecting to like fight a boss like you're fighting, I don't know, fucking any like bullet sponge boss or sword sponge boss where you're like just hit him a lot, like, you are going to lose. And I think that there's a way where that is sort of the default assumption people have, where like, I got a big sword, I'm gonna go fight somebody, and you go swing in their face, and everything feels random, and you just die, and you're like, why the fuck did I die? And you go do it again, you keep dying. I think that like that is the truth for people who are starting these games. But I think that like the reason that people like me and you play these games is because like they are, I'm not going to say they're not hard, because they are difficult, but like every single boss and encounter, except for the Crucible Knight,